recording started.
Alright, so the first reflection essay is due tomorrow, that's Friday, by the end of the day. And you need to select one of the articles that written by Alexander Campbell, listed on the assignments, so if you're wanting to get the bonus points, wanting to do all five, make sure to complete that first one, which is due tomorrow. Next week, I will have the study guide ready for the first exam. I know it seems odd that we're already talking about the first exam, but that's 2 weeks ahead of time, so it's still a couple weeks off, but it's going to come up quick. So I want to get the study guide out to you so you can prepare. So it's going to be sometime the first week in February is when that's coming. So that's going to be going up pretty quickly. Today we are picking up with talking about some of the American backgrounds, some of the things that were in the context, the culture of the United States, well, first the colonies and then the United States, as it develops into this early republic period. The period from the Constitution about to 1830 is usually the early republic, and so that's the time period we're looking at, thinking about some of the political, social, and we're going to get into some of the religious changes and developments that are going on that are important for understanding how what the context is like when the Restoration movement develops. And specifically, we finished up by noting the importance of the First Amendment, with the guarantee of the free exercise of religion, as well as its prohibition against Congress choosing a religion to establish as the national church. It provides an opportunity for a lot of people to have more religious choices. And so there are a couple of religious consequences that come out of the First Amendment and its position. One of the first is the development of religious freedom. Now, from the year 1688, English colonies had religious freedom for Protestants. So if you were part of a non-Anglican group, like let's say the Baptists, the Presbyterians, eventually the Methodists, you did have some freedom of religion. You were still expected to pay taxes to the Church of England if it was the established church, but you weren't prohibited by law from practicing. In the case of, for example, Catholics, however, you still had laws against the practice of Catholicism. In the colonies, Catholics were not allowed to hold office. Sometimes they were not allowed to vote. So with the development of the First Amendment, this allowed a lot of religious freedom. You didn't feel there wasn't the coercion to be part of a church, which did mean, of course, the freedom to not be religious. Not that there were too many people at that time that were that way. So freedom of religion, freedom of religious practice, particularly. Secondly was the development of the separation of church and state. The Establishment Clause prohibited the federal government from declaring a national church, although in the states, many of them did have an established state church for a while, although those constitutions were gradually revised in the 19th century where there aren't any established churches anymore in any of the states. The phrase separation of church and state, not found specifically in the Constitution, but comes up in a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote while president. A group of Baptists from New England who had experienced religious establishment with the Congregational Church found themselves having to pay taxes to the Congregationalist Church because it was the established church there in Connecticut. wanted to know if, how the First Amendment protected them. Essentially, Jefferson wrote in response that the First Amendment erected a wall of separation between church and state. And so Jefferson believed that state and church should not intermingle. And then the next day, after writing that letter, he went and worshipped in the House of Representatives at a religious service. So, sure, go ahead.
I've always wanted to know this. When he said that he didn't want church and state to be intermingled, like, what exactly did he mean?
He essentially meant that he did not believe that the government should support any specific church.
Like paying preachers?
Like paying preachers, collecting taxes and giving them to churches. And then he also felt like any one particular church shouldn't have an influence on the state, in the sense of, like, throughout Eastern Europe or Western Europe in the Reformation period, a lot of churches had a lot of influence on the state. And essentially, for Jefferson, he thought religion was good, however, because it made ethical, moral people.
Right.
So it's not like he wants it's not like he was wanting to get rid of religion, but he doesn't want the state kind of enforcing on people's consciences, you have to go to this church, you have to practice this religion.
That's going to cause a problem.
Yeah. Because one of the things that you begin to see, especially with Jefferson, is this view that religion should be a private matter of conscience. Now, for Jefferson and a lot of founders, that didn't mean that you couldn't talk about religion. Obviously, there were prayers said before, sessions of Congress, even before the United States. So there was, the wall of separation has always had a lot of checkpoints where people can cross. But his arguments have since been used to try and say that essentially the state should be agnostic, that religion, that essentially when religious people want to participate in the public sphere, they have to kind of leave the religious views and religious reasons at the door, right? And so if you're trying to convince somebody of something, you can't be using bringing anything. And that's one of the things that I thought was really important about some of the things that President Obama said as he was running for office, is that religion is such a part of people that they can't leave it at the door. But there should be that recognition that in the public square there are Christians, there are Muslims, there are atheists, there are Jews, and those kind of things. So it's got to be a recognition of diversity and the separation of church and state, but also the recognition that religious people are going to bring their religious reasons into it.
Okay.
And so how that separation of church and state is supposed to work itself out has been problematic at various times. But that, of course, along with religious freedom, meant that people didn't have to be coerced to go to church or to go to a specific church, which meant that people had some more choices, which allowed for the flowering of denominations across the board. That even though there was technically religious freedom, the state church held a lot of sway in these places, in the colonies. But now there was a lot more freedom, and so you see the rise of all sorts of denominations. And so, for example, prior to the Revolution, the two biggest churches are the Church of England and the Congregationalist Church, which is the group that comes from the Puritans. After the Revolution, within just a few years, the biggest churches are the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, and the Presbyterian Church. And the Anglican Church, the Church of England, has to become the Episcopalian Church because people are a little suspicious of you have ties back to England, all right? And so they have to kind of recreate themselves.
Who are the two biggest churches? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
the two biggest churches, like pre-denominationalism.
Well, pre-Revolution,
Pre-revolution, okay.
Pre-revolution is the Church of England and the Congregationalist Church.
Okay. Okay, now we're good.
So, which were established churches. They were state churches. But you start to see a shift with the Presbyterian Church, the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, those becoming the big churches. And then a bunch of new religious movements developing as well. Some of those, we might say, more traditional denominations. And then sometimes, as you get into the 1820s, 1830s, some more unorthodox groups. The Mormons develop in the 1830s. Christian Science develops in the 1840s or so. Seventh-day Adventists in the 1840s. Jehovah's Witnesses in the late 1800s. So you see all these groups kind of springing up. And well, I mean, prior to this point, there are denominations, like the Baptists were around, the Presbyterians were around, but they weren't very big in those Anglo-American places, the places where England was a big influence. It also meant, so while all these groups are developing, it also meant that churches kind of had changed some of the way in which they practiced. I mean, when you are a minister in an established church where your salary is paid by the state and it comes from the taxes, there's no reason why you would necessarily be concerned about trying to keep your numbers up in the church, except for, the kind of, I mean, if you really believe this, you want more people to be saved, right? If you believe your church is the way to be saved. But once that establishment goes, church leadership now has to recognize that it's based on people wanting to be a part of that particular religious group. So there's a shift where you kind of have to set out why people should be a part of that particular group, as opposed to just kind of sitting back and collecting your salary. Which in some cases has led some churches and some congregations to essentially kind of market their church. But I mean, that's the kind of situation that develops, is that people aren't forced to go to church.
And this is volunteerism?
Yes. And so that people are now, going to church is voluntary. So there is that need to appeal to people to convince them to be a part of a group, as opposed to having the force of government saying, you have to go to this church or be a member of this church. And then finally, with the revolution, there is an intertwining of Christianity and patriotism in the United States. To be a good Christian meant you were a patriot. To be a good patriot for a lot of people meant that you had to be a Christian as well. And so there's a lot of Christian nationalism intertwined in all of that. And so you're kind of seeing the people believing that the United States is kind of God's nation, those kind of ideas. Now, certainly in previous places there had been an intertwining of religion and nationalism. So, if you're a German, you think a lot about, your religion as a German Christian as opposed to, a French Christian or something like that. One expression of how a lot of these things intertwine is what's known as the Second Great Awakening. We talked last class about the Great Awakening, which is this movement of revivalism that takes place in the middle of the 18th century, where a lot of people are recommitting themselves to Christianity, converting to religious groups. There's that emotional connection. As we noted, that kind of dies down towards the Revolution, but after the Revolution, it picks back up. The revivalism always continued. I mean, there would be outbreaks of people being, really worked up emotionally about their salvation, congregation is seeing these moments of intense growth, but it's a lot more scattered than it was in this kind of concentrated period of the 1730s to the 1750s. At the early part of the 19th century, however, we see an explosion again of people joining churches, of preachers emotionally moving audiences. And so there's a lot of talk about Christianity, becoming Christians, remaining Christians, what all that means. And for the Second Great Awakening, it pops up in a couple of different places throughout the United States, taking on some slightly different forms depending on where it was. So essentially there are three fronts to the Second Great Awakening. The first of the major fronts was in the West. Now, the West we're talking about here is Kentucky, Tennessee. We don't think of this as the West anymore, but in the late 18th, early 19th century, that's essentially the boundary of the United States. We're talking slightly before the Louisiana Purchase, and so the Mississippi River serves as a boundary, for example, of how far west. And so it's very sparse, sparsely settled place. There are few religious communities, a lot of focus on the land, lots of violence, and in the middle of this, in the 19th century, there are some revivals that begin to take place that bring a lot of religious attention to this. Well, before we go to the Northeast, let's talk about the West a little bit more. One of the key things in the West is the emotionalism. Right? This was a very emotional experience for people in the West. So there's a lot of experience of people being emotionally moved and very, very extreme expressions of religion or emotionalism. So there is a man named James McGreedy who travels around Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, having some of these revivals. And people are passing out during the services. They are screaming for salvation. People are coming to these things hundreds of miles, traveling hundreds of miles to go to these services. In Gasper River, Kentucky, for example, people are coming from hundreds of miles, and up to 8,000 people came to this revival, which for the time period is a pretty big number. Another big one of his that we'll talk about in a little bit is a revival that takes place in Cane Ridge in Kentucky. We'll pick that up when we talk about Barnard Stone here in a little bit, because that's very important for his movement towards restoration.
When you say passing out, do you mean like kids in the Holy Ghost passing out?
Yeah, that they would just they would just kind of be so emotionally moved they would just fall, pass out. And there's some other things that take place, and we'll talk more about them when we talk about Cane Ridge. But there's, as you might expect, there was a lot of resistance to some of this by more traditional people who felt that this is just emotional excess, this is disorder. There are some people who would claim that at some of these revivals there were more souls created than converted. That in the emotionalism there wasn't just religion going on, there were a lot of other things, some of which were immoral. And some of these camp meetings were made illegal because 9 months after them, there tended to be a lot of single mothers. Right? So some of these revivals face a lot of opposition because of some of the other. So there's the emotionalism that people don't like, and then there's some of the other things that are going on as well. So in the West, the emphasis is it's very much on emotion, but you also see a shift taking place in that a lot of the Protestantism that is in the United States up to this point had been shaped by John Calvin. And that Calvinism meant that there was a belief that certain people, God had chosen before time, certain people to be saved and certain people to be condemned, and that you essentially did not have a choice in the matter. And that if you were one of the chosen, God was going to make sure, the Spirit was going to affect your life so that you did convert and then live a holy life. But with the Second Great Awakening, especially in the West, more and more people began to preach that it wasn't, God didn't choose who was going to be saved and who was going to be lost, but He left it up to human beings to respond to the gospel or not. They had the freedom to choose or reject the gospel. So in the West, there's kind of emphasis on choice as well as emotion.